As the world transitions from a unipolar to a multipolar dynamic, one country stands at the crossroad of this transformation: India. To help us decode India's role in this multipolar world, we are privileged here at A Tryst with Statecraft to be joined by an expert in this field, Ms. Jyotsna Mehra. Jyotsna is a foreign policy professional specializing in research, advocacy, and strategic communication. In 2024, she founded Closed Door Policy Consulting after holding significant consulting roles with India's Ministry of External Affairs and Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, where she helped shape Indian foreign policy. She holds a degree in modern South Asian studies from the University of Oxford and a bachelor's in politics and international relations from the University of Manchester. With extensive experience collaborating with think tanks across the UK, US, and India, Jyotsna brings deep expertise on global power relations and Indo-Pacific affairs. Her fellowship at the Stimson Center and her induction into the Pacific Forum Young Leaders Program are testaments to her insightful contributions to international discourse. Today, we are privileged to have Ms. Jyotsna to guide us through India's positioning within this multipolar world, balancing global power shifts and deepening influence in the Indo-Pacific region, and charting its future at this new era. Ms. Jyotsna, it's an absolute honor to have you at this episode of A Tryst with Statecraft.
Thank you, Teresa. I'm really glad to be here.
All right, without further ado, let's get started with this incredible episode of A Tryst with Statecraft. My first question to you is, how is India's maintaining a multi-alignment stance in global politics in today's world?
Teresa, that's an excellent question. Actually, that's, the very central question that drives our foreign policy. But before jumping onto that, I'd like to quickly address the question of non-alignment, multi-alignment, and strategic autonomy, because a lot of times people conflate those terms. So a quick briefer on that. So since independence, India has had a policy which may be broadly considered a policy of equidistance in international affairs. Now, that has gone through several shifts over the last 7 to 8 decades. So, right after independence, during the Nehruvian times, we jumped straight into the Cold War. So we had a policy of non-alignment. As you know, that this was a more ideological distancing from both the poles of power, the US and the USSR at the time. But in hindsight, it's considered, especially by its critics, distancing for the sake of distancing. The idea was that a newly independent, economically weak India could not afford to be dependent on a big power once again. So India was operating in an international order which was divided into 2 broad blocks, and India avoided proximity towards either of those 2 blocks. And as we moved towards the 70s, the policy began moving closer towards the USSR. But we have to remember that our policy was shaped by external circumstances. Most notable during that time was the posture that the United States took towards India and its decision to arm Pakistan. And as we moved towards the 1990s, we started departing from non-alignment because the Soviet Union had fallen and our economy began liberalizing. So India spent around the next 2 decades building closer ties with the West, especially with Washington, while maintaining good relations with Russia. So around this time, as India's economy began growing, we saw greater investment from the West. There was an effort to diversify also India's arms exports. So we moved from sanctions post our nuclear weapons testing in 1998 to actually finalizing a civil nuclear deal with the US in 2008. And now, under PM Modi, over the last 10 years, what has happened is often called multi-alignment and strategic autonomy. India is now leveraging partnerships and making them work for us. We are not shunning partnerships for the sake of it, but we are leveraging them. So national interests are central, and partnerships are being built around those interests. So where you have, say, a Quad on one hand, you have something like BRICS or SCO on the other hand. And as you saw recently, within weeks, Prime Minister visited both Russia and Ukraine. And we've had a very careful balancing, when it comes to the war in Israel. So, of course, India's rise and its greater geopolitical salience has facilitated India to invest in a range of partnerships. One way of doing this has also been diversifying our dependencies and reducing those dependencies by building indigenous capabilities. And this happens across a variety of areas. This could be arms, this could be trade, this could be investment, this could be technology. So we're working with a huge range of players from Russia to US, Israel, France, especially as you know, in the arms sector, we've diversified our imports. And India has also begun investing in its own indigenous capabilities to produce efficient defense platforms and also to export them to friendly countries. And of course, geography plays a key role here, and that is something that you have no control over. So while US is a major, perhaps the most important partner to us when it comes to balancing China, Russia also plays a very important role in this respect. And you just have to look at a map to understand that.
Well, that's all the more introduction we need for this incredible episode. Well, I'm really happy to know that there has been a sequential adoption and maybe, dare I say, an unreliance to this non-aligned policy. And it's so empowering to know that our country has now emerged as one of the most emerging powers of the world, where we've maintained diplomatic yet neutral stances on key issues around the globe. So this policy has played a very instrumental role in determining our stances in global issues. My next question is, what strategy is India employing to maintain its strategic autonomy while navigating relations with major powers like the US, China, and like you've mentioned, Russia and Ukraine?
Yeah, so I mean, just taking on from that first question here. So let me come to China first. So China and India, as you know, do not have a cordial relationship. China wants to contain our influence in our neighborhood, and it wants to become the most preeminent power in our region. And China is known for changing facts, inventing history to suit its territorial claims. In fact, we didn't even have China as our neighbor before Tibet was annexed. So we know this reality. And long before the West even woke up to the reality of, say, a Belt and Road Initiative, India was already opposing Chinese attempts to mask strategic intentions with economic projects. Post Galwan, our relationship with China has been described by our leadership, including our external affairs minister, as abnormal. So that's what we work with, even though there has been some progress in the talks, but we know that China now forms the biggest threat to India, far greater than Pakistan. But there's also another reality, which is that China produces a lot of stuff and India buys a lot of this stuff. So China is India's top trade partner, and we're trying to reduce this dependency on China by building our own strengths. But for that, we need strong government at center with a large mandate, and that the will to take major policy decisions to pave way for structural changes in our economy and across various sectors. We are trying to counterbalance China by investing in a lot of avenues. So in tech, in domestic manufacturing, in space, military, and so on. But we are also investing in our relationships with key partners. And chief amongst these relationships is our relationship with the United States. And perhaps that's India's most important partner at this point, like I said. We work with US on basically all possible areas where one can work with another country. So US is our second largest trade partner. We get high-end tech from the US. We have been buying key equipment from them. We just announced a major semiconductor initiative with them. Obviously, also our people-to-people ties with them are very, very crucial to this relationship. We also work with them within many minilaterals and plurilaterals. So you've got Quad, you've got I2U2, you've got various other trilaterals with Japan. You've got and the bilateral itself works in a variety of spaces. So I mentioned the Quad. Our aim within the Quad is to give the region an option to counterbalance China's presence here. And we do that through several avenues. Of course, people say that Quad is not about a military alliance, but Quad works, across a range of areas to challenge China's influence here. So India knows that it is likely to be the first target of hostility from China. So India treads very carefully in ensuring that its relationship with other partners, especially when it comes to China, does not really, harm India in a major way. So just like our region needs options when it comes to US and China, India also needs its options. So US and India have had historical mistrust, especially around the 70s. And there continues to be occasional sprouts of irritants in our relationship. As you know, um, many of them are to do with some basic concerns that we have with terrorism and national security. So Russia has historically given us that other option. It's been an old friend, it's been a trustworthy friend. Russia is also critical for us because of our complicated relationship with China. India thinks that a strong, proud country like Russia should not be made to feel like a junior partner of China. And that we should have that link with Russia so that Russia, which is a close partner of China, is able to influence Chinese policy vis-a-vis India to some extent. So I think that's how broadly we manage US, China, and Russia relations, where China is seen as an adversary, but you also have to have areas where you work with them because they're your neighbors. And I'm talking about Russia. So I said that it's been an old and trustworthy friend since for a few decades now. So when it comes to China, we know that we have an adversarial relationship, but we also know the reality that China is a strong neighbor that we have to live with. And when it comes to Russia and the US, we have to manage those relationships, and they're both important partners in their own right.
Well, I think just like you said, India carefully selects alliances that benefit, first of all, their stance in global affairs. And it's very crucial whether we're exchanging our material and immaterial resources with such global powers that the beneficiaries are more than just the disadvantages. Now, that's with regard to major veto powers in the world. Let's talk about the immediate neighbors of India. How can India leverage its neighborhood first and look east policies to address challenges posed by China's growing influence in South Asia, according to you?
Yeah, sure. So obviously, neighborhood has been in the news recently. Relationships with countries in your immediate neighborhood are always complicated. So there's just always a lot going on. There are ethnic, cultural, religious, historic fault lines that you have to deal with. And especially in our case, where we are a large and relatively powerful country in our neighborhood, we are surrounded by smaller, relatively weaker countries. Many of them have historically, at one point or another, actually been a part of the larger Indian system. So there are bound to be challenges, there's bound to be friction. So these smaller countries will undoubtedly be driving their foreign policy in relation to India in a positive sense or a negative sense. And they would try to balance both India and the other major external power in the region. In this case, most notably today, that's China. We saw what happened with Bangladesh. The situation there is definitely a cause of worry for us, given that we enjoyed a relatively long period of stable, cordial ties and mutually beneficial ties, honestly, with Bangladesh under Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina. We now have a range of hostile actors exercising influence in Bangladesh. So we need to deal with that. We faced a similar, difficult, not similar, not to the same extent, but still quite a difficult situation in Maldives last year. After, the president of Maldives now, President Muizu, actually became president after an anti-India campaign. It was called the India Out campaign, where they wanted to get rid of Indian investments, Indian role in Maldives, generally speaking. But we've seen now in Maldives ultimately that the government had to warm up to India. So India has over the years invested so deeply in various sectors of countries in our neighborhood that even hostile anti-India rhetoric has its limits there. So, you're talking about railways, hydro projects, roadways, airports, ports, digital infrastructure, housing projects, hospitals, what have you. And the investment has gone from India into all of our neighbors, except Pakistan, for obvious reasons. And a lot of our humanitarian and disaster relief operations have also been executed for our neighbors in time of need. So, you've got a Nepal earthquake, a cyclone somewhere, something. So, Indian forces are then deployed, and Indian medical aid, humanitarian aid gets sent. So, India has, in that sense, cultivated that influence and goodwill in these countries. So, what has happened is that India is now a major factor in the domestic politics of our neighboring countries. So much so that we saw recently Hasina and the previous Maldivian government were seen domestically as Indian proxies. So, most of our neighbors have tried to play the China card against us. So, Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Maldives, Pakistan is, of course, another level. And Afghanistan and Afghanistan and Myanmar have their own set of problems. Bhutan is a very friendly country, but Bhutan might also normalize its ties with China soon. And China has made sharp inroads into our neighborhood and the larger Indian Ocean region. We've been managing the impact of this through our own set of investments, like I said, in connectivity, infrastructure projects, through political and military relationships that we've built with these countries. But we have to live with the fact that an unfriendly neighborhood is a reality for most big and powerful countries. But ultimately, these countries also have to live with the fact that India is their immediate neighbor and not China. And when it comes to Southeast Asia, so actually our policy has moved from look east to act east. So ties with Southeast Asian countries have grown, and we work on a lot of areas together with them. And the focus has been on sectors like healthcare, education, agriculture, trade and investment, technology, green energy, and we have historical, cultural, civilizational ties with them. And even our defense and maritime ties, especially with Vietnam and Philippines, are now quite deep. As you know, they are parties in the South China Sea dispute. And Prime Minister Modi was in Singapore last week, and we signed a major semiconductor ecosystem partnership with them. So the region, of course, is central to the future of the Indo-Pacific and therefore of the world. And our ties with individual countries and with ASEAN itself are only expanding here.
Well, that's giving us all the more hope with regard to India's strategic alliances with its direct neighbors. Now, we started this episode defining the term multipolarity in terms of geopolitics. What, according to you, could be the way in which India leverages its soft power to enhance its influence and create a stronger position for itself in a multipolar world?
Sure. So, I believe that ultimately hard power, your military capabilities and your economic capabilities, they speak the loudest. You can build a fair share of goodwill among countries by, say, taking yoga global, by talking about Gandhi, by, through Bollywood or through, chicken tikka masala, what have you. But in a deeply divided, polarized world that we live in today, we need to continue investing in our hard power abilities to continue building geopolitical capital. That is where the buck stops. That's how you get to the top. But like you said, we live in a multipolar world, and especially with countries in the global south, we need to continue building goodwill that we have invested in over the last few decades. And a lot of countries do not have that advantage that we have. You've seen how India has been hosting this Voice of the Global South Summit, which is one way how we do that. During the pandemic, a lot of our vaccines went to countries in the global south. And that was seen as a very, very nice, very good move in terms of maintaining that goodwill in countries of the global south. So the difference is that where India builds relations with countries in the global south, and it can act as a link between the global south and the global north. China only builds relations with the global south because it wants them to stand against the global north. So India is blessed with some incredible soft power, soft power avenues that we could exploit. So literature, ancient thought, languages, our major fashion giants, food, cultures. And yes, ensuring that through private and public sector interventions, we should take these strengths to the world and we should continue to do that because this is helping reintroduce a rising India to the world. Soft power alone can only take us so far, but soft power together with hard power ensures that we expand our influence globally and have the necessary tools that we need to shape the world more effectively to suit our interests.
Well, as you mentioned, this infusion of soft and hard power is a very crucial mix in strengthening our stance in global affairs. And India is able to tread quite enduringly in whatever obstacles it may be pursuing, whether it's the ongoing conflict in Israel and Gaza or the remnants of the Russia-Ukraine war. It's very important to note that India has treaded on quite diligently and choosing the right strategies while not compromising on its most strategic partners. Now, my last question to you before we wrap up this interview would be, how can India leverage the political activism of its youth to advance its role in global governance reforms to reflect the multipolarity of the world?
So when it comes to leveraging our youth, yes, so we have actually, it was historically said that India has that advantage over China, where its young people speak English and they are based, all across the world. And I think that to some extent still continues to hold true. We have, a whole ton of smart people who study abroad and who contribute to India's, to who contribute positively to India. The only thing I would say is that India needs to younger people who go abroad, India needs to find ways so that they also contribute to Indian economy back home and they're brought back. And for that, there's a lot of work that needs to be done domestically. But yes, our young people, very savvy, very, top of the class and based all over the world. And again, like I mentioned, all those soft power avenues, um, that would be one way where the young people of our country could play a role. And I have noticed, and I think there are studies to prove this, that more and more young people in India are now interested in international affairs. 10 years ago, when I got into the field, there were not lots of courses being offered in India in international affairs. And now there's been a whole range of courses across private and public universities being offered to students here in India. So that means younger Indians have started thinking about the world, have started thinking about their place and their country's place in the world, and have started putting an Indian lens to thinking of the world, which is very important that we do not just think of the world from a Eurocentric or Western perspective, but build our capabilities to actually, to really just have an authentic Indian view of the world. Once we start doing that, I think that would contribute greatly to India's rise.
Well, that glimmer of hope gives us all the more anticipation on what the youth can provide for India's journey in cementing its diplomatic stance across the world. And it's so enlightening, like you've said, there's a completely big shift in the opting for international affairs by today's youth, because we're all the more excited to see these intricacies of international affairs blend with India's cultural and, of course, our social values. On that note, we come to the end of this incredible and insightful episode of A Tryst with Statecraft. Ms. Jyotsna, I can't express how grateful I am to have this time with you and get to know the intricacies of all these strategies that have helped India run a victorious race in this very multipolar world. And it's really insightful to know that youth, especially, have grown more and more rooted and interested in understanding these leashes as well. And we can't thank you enough for your time on this episode. And we can't wait to see all your future endeavors unfold. And we can't wait to see you in more future projects and establishments that align with these causes, and hopefully more youth involved. On that note, we come to the end of this episode of Futurists with Statecraft. I'm your host, Teresa Kuruvilla, signing out.